I was home alone. It was just a regular Tuesday. I had made tea, as usual. The kettle was still whistling when everything began to spin. A sudden dizziness, a sharp pain behind my right eye, and the feeling that half of my face was melting. I tried to speak, tried to call someone. No one. Only my irregular breathing, the sound of the kettle, and the silence of the walls. I grabbed my phone with my left hand, the only one still obeying. I called Carla first. Voicemail. Then Enrique. Call rejected. Douglas, he always answers quickly, I thought. He sent me a voice message. Hi, Mom. I'm entering a meeting. If it's urgent, text me. Urgent. I was just having a stroke. I was the one who dialed 192. The ambulance arrived after 17 minutes. On the way, I remember the nurse saying, Do you have children? Should we call someone? And I said yes. 3. She wrote down the numbers. Later, I found out they called all of them. No one answered. No one called back. I spent 3 days in the ICU. 3 days with my eyes closed and my soul open. 3 days waiting for a visit, a call, any display of affection. Nothing. On the second day, Enrique sent a message. Mom, could you transfer $2,000 to me? The bank blocked my limit. On the third day, Carla sent a flower gif with the caption, Get well, Mom. And on the fourth day, I got up. Not because I was well, but because I understood. I understood everything. It wasn't the stroke that broke my heart. It was the absence. It was the echo of what didn't come. The hugs that never arrived. The voices that never crossed the hospital door. And in that white bed, with the smell of saline and sadness, I saw myself for the first time as I truly was, a used woman. Like a bank with no fees, like an emotional Uber, like a housekeeper in the lives of others. I remembered when I sold half of my jewelry to pay for Enrique's college, when I gave up a dream trip to cover the down payment for Carla's first apartment. When I lied to my husband saying, it's better to let Douglas mess up on his own. When he crashed the car and blamed a neighbor. I always defended them. I always protected them. And in the end, who protected me? No one. In the hospital, an assistant named Fabiana held my hand. A woman who barely knew me. She washed my hair, rubbed lotion on my legs, and said, Hang in there, Mrs. Regina. You're going to get through this. I never heard that from any of my children. What hurt me most wasn't the absence. It was the certainty that if I had died there, they would only be concerned with the inventory. And maybe they wouldn't even know what was really inside that old scarf cupboard or that sewing box where I keep the wedding rings. Maybe they wouldn't even know that behind the hallway cabinet, there's a photo of them when they were little, sleeping together on the couch. Because that was my legacy. Loving until the end. But now I understand. Time healed me more than any medicine. And disappointment was my most bitter remedy, but also the most effective. The day I was discharged, I took a taxi home. Alone, with a small bag of clothes, and my soul in silence. And it was there, on the way back, that I made my decision. If they weren't by my side when I needed them as a mother, they will have no place by my side as heirs. And that's not revenge. It's justice. From here on out, it's me for me. And the world better watch out. Returning home was not a relief. It was a shock. Silence greeted me at the door with a coldness that even the hospital hadn't dared to impose. No welcome home balloons, no flowers, no note stuck to the fridge. Not even a "Hi, Mom, you made it." Nothing. Just the sound of keys in the lock and the creak of a door that no one bothered to open for me anymore. I spent whole days at home recovering, in silence, struggling to walk, sitting for hours in the armchair that, ironically, one of my children gave me on Mother's Day. For you to relax, Mom. The same armchair where I waited for one of them to show up. Where I watched time pass through the window like a parade of indifference. What struck me most in those days was my phone. Yes, the phone. That treacherous little device that vibrates as if carrying good news, but in reality, only reminded me of the absence. The messages that came were absurdly soulless. Enrique sent me a 7-second voice note. Mom, how are you? Getting better? I'm super busy. I'll talk to you later. He never talked later. Carla sent a selfie in which she appeared tanned, with her blonde hair blowing in the wind, and the caption, "Recharging my energies."
Kisses, Mom.
Douglas didn't even pretend. After a week at home, the nurse from the hospital, Fabiana, my angel, came to visit. She brought me cookies and tea. Do you know what she said? "Mrs. Regina, I think about you every day. You have a light that doesn't match all this abandonment." I smiled. But inside, something was already breaking. It wasn't just hurt. It was a deep exhaustion from being useful only when it mattered. A feeling that I was just an emotional credit card, always available, never valued. I started to notice the details. The hairbrush Carla had left here the last time she stayed at my house, 6 months ago. The shirt Enrique had forgotten, and I kept it smelling nice, waiting for him to come pick it up. The photo frame with a picture of the three of them together on my 60th birthday, the last time they seemed to care. Little by little, I saw that every object around me was, in fact, a reminder of how much I had given, of how I had broken myself into pieces to fit into each of their lives. I remember the day Enrique asked for a loan to pay for the new car. "It will appreciate, Mom. It's an investment. I'll pay you in 3 months." 3 years. I never saw a cent. I remember when Carla wanted to take a fashion course in Milan, and I sold a family ring, my late mother's, to pay for the ticket. She came back from Europe speaking more Italian than love. And Douglas, well, Douglas was always the most distant. The middle child, who lived resentful, but never stopped asking. Once, he pretended to be depressed, so I wouldn't cancel his allowance. I later found out he was on a trip in Trancoso with his friends. I always knew, but I always forgave.
Why?
Out of fear. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of not being needed. Because every mother who gave too much, deep down, has this fear of no longer being useful when the children grow up. But this stroke didn't just come to bring me down physically. It came to wake me up. I started writing. A journal. A black notebook with a hard cover. In it, I began to record every time I felt invisible. Every request for money without affection. Every phone call with haste. Every visit that never happened. Every emotional wound. Day 3 after discharge, Enrique calls to ask if I managed to release the payment for his health insurance, which had expired. Day 5, Carla sends an email with a quote for a cosmetic surgery, asking if I would consider gifting it to her. Day 7, Douglas asks if he can use my apartment as collateral for a loan. None asked how my physical therapy was going. None wanted to know how I was feeling emotionally. None brought me a jar of soup. A hug. A sincere look. On day 10, Fabiana came to visit me again. She brought flowers from her own garden. We sat and talked about books.
She listened to me.
She saw me. She treated me like someone who matters. At the end, she held my hand and said, "You have the right to be happy, Regina. It's not selfish." It was the first time anyone gave me permission to think about myself. That night, I slept deeply. For the first time in weeks. And when I woke up, the world was already different. Not because it changed, but because I had finally put the right lenses on my eyes. I realized I wasn't loved. I was tolerated. And being tolerated is the cruelest form of rejection because it comes disguised as coexistence. I grabbed my black notebook. I wrote on the last page, "From today on, anyone who doesn't seek me out for love will not have me out of obligation."
And I put it away.
But this time, I didn't put it away with sadness. I put it away like someone who is planning something. Like someone who understands that love is not an eternal debt. And that forgiveness is not an invitation to continue being hurt. That morning, I called my lawyer. I scheduled a meeting. And for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. Not for others, but for myself. Revenge didn't have a name yet. But justice already had a set date. They say time heals all wounds. That's a lie. Time doesn't heal. It reveals. It peels back the layers of the soul until it shows what was hidden. And what time revealed to me, after the pain, the silence, the indifference of my children, was that I had been foolish for far too long. but no more. That morning, I put on simple clothes, quickly tied my hair into a bun, and went to the notary's office. I requested a second copy of my old will. When they handed it to me, it felt like they were giving me back my identity. Because there, in that pile of paper, was the proof of how much I had given beyond my limits. It was all planned. Half to Enrique, 30% to Carla, 20% to Douglas. I had even distributed personal belongings and properties. I thought of everything. Who would get my grandmother's porcelain, the piano in the living room, the wedding ring. Everything done with the care of someone who believes that, in the end, love will prevail. Foolishness. I was giving them not just my wealth, but my story, my memory, my essence. And they were spitting on it with every automatic message, every selfish request, every calculated absence. I called my lawyer, Dr. Mario, a distinguished, gray-haired man who has known me for over 15 years. When I arrived at his office, he greeted me with his usual smile. "Regina, it's great to see you recovered. I was worried about your stroke." "Thank you, Mario," I said, sitting down carefully, "but I'm here today for another reason. I want to redo my will. From scratch." He raised his eyebrows, curious. "Of course. Any specific changes?"
Yes.
"All of them. My children will inherit nothing." Silence. One of those silences that weighs more than a shout. "Nothing? Nothing." He adjusted his glasses and said cautiously, "Regina, are you sure about this?" "More than I've ever been sure about anything in my life." Mario didn't insist. He simply started typing, with the calmness of someone who knows there is pain behind every radical decision. He knew. I could see it in his eyes. But he said nothing. He just listened while I dictated. "I want to leave the mountain house to the NGO La Esperanza, which takes in elderly people without family. The house in the city center goes to the Instituto Dona Lucia, which cares for abandoned women. The value of the bank investments will be divided among 3 organizations that care for post-stroke rehabilitation patients. And the movable assets? Jewelry, paintings, the car? Hold a charity auction. Everything goes toward basic food baskets and medical equipment. And personal belongings? I thought. There were things I hated to part with, but it hurt more imagining them in the wrong hands. The photo albums will be donated. The paintings, keep them with the NGO. The piano, if possible, should go to a nursing home. I want someone to actually play it, not just use it as decoration." Mario nodded. He was serious, respectful. I signed the documents with the firmness of someone saying goodbye to an old version of themselves. At the end, I asked, "Can I include a conditional clause?" "Of course. I want it recorded that any attempt to legally contest this will by my children will result in the immediate loss of any right to symbolic possessions. Not even clothes. Not a single cup." He agreed, took note, and I felt something new.
Peace.
On the way back home, I asked the taxi driver to take a longer route. I passed by old streets, squares where I had taken my young children to play.
I saw the swings still there.
The benches that once held my exhaustion as a mother. And I found myself crying, but not out of sadness. It was a pure cry. A cry of liberation. In the following days, I started putting a restructuring plan into action. First, I cut off the monthly transfers. Carla sent a casual message. "Mom, the bank app isn't recognizing the transfer. Is it a bug?" I replied,
No.
"What's failing isn't the app, it's your memory." It took her a while, but she understood. She never replied again. Enrique called, irritated. "What do you mean you're not going to help me anymore?" "I'm counting on this." I replied calmly, "Son, if you have a stroke tomorrow, who will give you a glass of water? Who will hold your hand?" He fell silent and hung up. Douglas just disappeared. As always, I started donating clothes, emptying the house, cleaning my memories. Every drawer I opened was a therapy session. I burned old letters, threw away shopping lists for my children, the ones where I wrote Enrique lactose-free, orange juice for Carla, cereal for Douglas. It no longer mattered. On the contrary, their absence made the house bigger, more mine. My story wouldn't end in loneliness. It would begin again in freedom. At the end of the month, Fabiana came to visit again. She brought a chicken pie and said, "You're different, Regina. Lighter." "Because I finally took off the weight of being the perfect mother," I replied. She laughed and cried. We created a simple friendship with no demands. We talked about old movies, recipes, how the world turns, and how the ungrateful always end up dizzy. It was then that I decided to create a project. A name came to me like an illumination. Children of the Void.
It was perfect.
A support group for abandoned elderly people. I began writing the statutes, thinking about meetings, looking for volunteers. I rented a small office in the city center. I began giving lectures, receiving other stories like mine, and worse. I discovered I wasn't alone, that there are legions of mothers and fathers who gave everything, and today don't even receive a phone call. The void my children left, I was filling with purpose. But a part of me still wanted them to see, not to regret, but to understand. I wanted them, one day, to stand before what they could have honored and chose to waste. And that day was approaching. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destroying someone. It's showing who you have become without them. I knew the moment was coming. The final confrontation, the true test of who I had become after so much time sacrificing myself in silence, without recognition, without return. It was no longer about revenge, as many might think. Revenge is an empty concept, something that feeds on anger and dissolves over time. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was justice. And it would not come if I kept waiting for them to wake up from their indifference. The change did not happen overnight, nor was it a sudden realization that I was ready. It grew inside me like a plant that silently begins to germinate deep in the earth until it reaches the light. Suddenly, I was more than a frustrated mother, more than an invisible woman. I was a woman who had control over her life and would no longer accept being the shadow of who I truly was. However, I knew that this transformation would not pass without a final test. One last act. Something that would force my children to recognize the value of everything I had given, of everything I had sacrificed. With each step, I felt the need to restore balance, to put things in their rightful place. It wasn't about punishing them. It was about giving something back to myself. Something I had never allowed myself to receive. Respect. The day of the confrontation arrived as naturally as the rain falls after a long drought. I had already made all the necessary adjustments. The will was ready, the Children of the Void project was underway, the house was emptier but lighter. I, more certain of who I was, more faithful to my purpose. I was the one who called Enrique. He was the first to realize that something was happening. I had never taken the initiative to arrange a meeting like this, and he knew that. "Mom, is everything okay? You called, that's rare." He spoke in a tone that tried to hide his concern, but the indifference was there, latent as always. "Enrique, we need to talk. I want you to come here tomorrow with Carla and Douglas. I have something important to discuss with you." He was silent for a few seconds. He knew that this important thing wasn't about money. It wasn't about any favor I could do. That voice, my voice, had something different, something he had never heard before. "Okay, Mom. I'll talk to them." When I hung up the phone, I didn't feel relief, but I didn't feel fear either. Feeling fear would mean that I still feared their reaction, and that no longer existed within me. The old Regina, who waited to be recognized, was no longer there. What remained was a woman who had learned what really matters. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the fleeting recognition.
It was respect.
And I would not negotiate that anymore. The night before the meeting was long. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind wouldn't stop reminding me of everything I had lived through. I thought about the sacrifices I had made throughout my life, about the loss of my own dreams to ensure my children had what they wanted. I had given them so much, and never asked for anything in return. And it was in that thought that the weight of my own kindness hit me. Not because I regretted it, but because I finally realized that my generosity had been a form of exchange for my own acceptance. And this, I knew now, was not healthy. Not for me, and not for them. The next day, they arrived punctually. Enrique, the most impatient, was the first to enter, followed by Carla and Douglas. None of them seemed really surprised, but the air was tense, as if everyone knew something big was about to happen. "Mom, what happened?" Enrique asked, trying to read my expression. "What happened is that you gave me the answer I needed, children," I said calmly, without shouting, but with an authority I had never possessed before. "And I have finally found what I needed to do." Carla frowned, impatient. "What are you saying, Mom?" "I'm saying you won't have anything for me anymore." The reaction was immediate. Enrique opened his mouth, but quickly fell silent. Carla started to protest, her voice louder than I expected. And Douglas, well, Douglas just watched as always. "What do you mean?" Enrique asked, now trying to stay calm. "Mom, are you serious? What happened? Are you okay?" I looked directly into his eyes, into the depths of his false concern, and answered without hesitation. "I'm more than fine, Enrique. I'm finally finding my peace. And for that, I need to cut ties with all of you. Not because I don't love you, but because I finally understood what you represent in my life. Ingratitude disguised as love. And that is something I can no longer carry. It is no longer my burden." Carla was starting to lose composure. "This is ridiculous, Mom. You're saying you're going to cut all ties because of a misunderstanding? Because of a difficult phase we're going through?" "No, Carla," I replied, now with the coldest calm I had ever possessed. "I'm cutting ties because I realized that you never really cared about what I felt. It was always about what I could do for you, not about what I truly needed. When I needed you, you didn't come. And that is something I cannot forget." The silence that followed was heavy. There were no more words I needed to say. I had already said everything I needed to. And more importantly, I had already done what I needed to do. The will was signed. Justice was in motion. Now, all that remained was to observe their reaction. Enrique, the shrewdest, was the first to try to reverse the situation. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly. Let's talk calmly, okay? It doesn't have to be like this. I know I've made mistakes, but No, I interrupted, with a firm voice. "There is nothing more to say. What you did with my love can no longer be fixed. There is nothing you can do to take it back." They didn't say anything else. Carla, angrily, looked at the floor and turned around, while Enrique tried, in vain, to convince me that I was making a mistake. But I knew I wasn't. Douglas, as always, left in silence, without more words, because he never had anything to say. When they left, the house was left in deep silence. But unlike the previous silences, this one wasn't empty. This silence was mine. And it was the most peaceful I had ever experienced. What remained now was to live without fear. Without the weight of pleasing, without the expectation of being remembered. And from that moment on, I was finally ready to see what my future would be like without the chains of guilt and disappointment. The phone didn't ring. The messages, those I used to wait for with a glimmer of hope, were now absent. The emptiness, which I once felt as an abyss, turned into a space where I was rediscovering myself. In the first few days after my decision, there was a kind of mild anxiety, almost imperceptible, that followed me. It wasn't regret, but a new weight. It was the weight of the truth finally admitted. The silence in the house was almost absolute. When my children were here, the house was never silent. There was always something happening, an argument, a request, a demand, or even their empty conversations about superficial things. Now, what remained was the tranquility of a home that breathed without the pressure of having to meet others' needs. Sometimes, I still found myself waiting for the phone to ring or for one of them to show up at the door with an apology or an attempt at reconciliation. But I knew that wouldn't happen. If it didn't come before, it wouldn't come now. Deep down, perhaps I had done what many would call the impossible. I cut not only material ties but emotional ones, and the price of that was beginning to show in a way I hadn't anticipated. Somewhere inside me, I felt I had chosen freedom. But freedom has a price. And it manifested not only in me, but in the emptiness that lingered. The house was no longer the same. It was quiet, but it wasn't cold anymore. I had filled what seemed like a void with memories, with new projects, and even with a quiet peace, but something told me that this peace wasn't complete. A part of me, perhaps the most human part, still wondered, did I do the right thing? I asked myself that during moments of calm, when I allowed myself to reflect on everything. It was then that Fabiana, the nurse who was accompanying me, did something that took me by surprise. One day, she showed up with a letter in her hand. I looked at it, and automatically, I thought it was just another one of those letters from the bank, another notice about financial matters. But when I opened the letter, my body froze. It was from Enrique. The letter was written in careful handwriting, but the words were loaded with a tone I wasn't sure if I should believe or not.
He was apologizing.
Not openly, but subtly, as if he were trying to make me understand that, somewhere deep down, he felt he had wronged me. He mentioned the hospital. He mentioned his absence, and that of the others, at the moment when I needed them most. He admitted he was aware of what he had done. But at the same time, he said he didn't know how to fix it. I know I did something terrible, Mom. I left you alone in those moments. But I didn't know how to deal with it. And now, I'm trying to understand what I can do to show you that I regret it. Enrique's words shook me, but they also left me with a strange feeling. I knew that, no matter how much he was trying to apologize, those words weren't enough. They weren't for me. They were for him. He wanted relief, not my absolution. I stared at the letter for a long time. I thought about Fabiana's words, which she always said, forgiveness, to be true, must come from within, without expectations. But what Enrique was doing wasn't asking for forgiveness. It was a plea to ease his own conscience. And I knew that. That night, after reading the letter several times, I started reflecting on the days ahead. I knew this moment would come. The moment when one or more of them would try to come back. What to do with that? Accept the apology, as if nothing had happened? Or move on, with the conviction that, no matter how much I love them, what happened was beyond forgiveness. The issue wasn't about what I would do with their regret, but about what I would do with myself after deciding to move on. I didn't want to go back to being the woman who, out of pity, out of a false idea of love, submits to pain. I didn't want to be the mother who does everything for others, without ever asking for anything in return. So I made a decision. The next day, I called Enrique. He answered quickly, as if he had been waiting. Enrique, I said with a firm but calm voice, I received your letter. But you have to understand one thing. It's not what you say that matters. What matters is what you do with your words. For a long time, I gave you what you wanted. I gave you my love, my attention, my unconditional support. But you never gave me anything but empty apologies and expectations. He fell silent. It was the first time he was hearing this. I could tell, by his voice, that he was trying to find an answer, but didn't know how. I understand, Mom. And I know I can't ask you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what I had just said. It was the truth, but it was also a painful truth. It wasn't the truth he wanted to hear, but it was the truth he needed to hear. The silence that followed was the greatest gift I could give to myself. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their validation. What I needed, more than anything, was peace. And that peace would only come if I continued my path, without expecting to be recognized by them. In the following weeks, nothing changed. Enrique tried to call one more time, but I didn't answer. Carla sent short messages, with a tone I couldn't identify. Maybe an attempt to get closer, maybe just to make sure I didn't forget her. But I didn't give in. What was happening was exactly what I wanted to happen. I was being tested. They were trying to make me return to the old routine of accepting their apologies, their requests, their empty promises. And I was resisting. Each resistance was a confirmation that I was on the right path. I was at peace with my decision. What impressed me the most, however, was the feeling of freedom that came with each of these silences. I was creating a new path for myself, a path without their emotional dependence, without the shackles of guilt. And with every step, I felt lighter. Now I understood. The freedom I was seeking wasn't in the actions of others, but in my own choices. I had created a new beginning for myself. And, perhaps, that was the greatest gift I could give my time continued its course, relentless, and with it, a sense that everything I had done was part of a process of self-discovery, a journey that, although solitary, was becoming clearer and clearer to me. I didn't know what the future held for me, but I knew, without a doubt, that my life could no longer be tied to the expectations of others. My home, now empty of my children's presence, was like a blank canvas waiting for my own brushstrokes. I was rebuilding my existence, and I had no intention of going back. The decision to sever ties with them, although painful, brought me an inexplicable peace. I felt no anger, nor bitterness. What I felt was an emotional distance, almost as if I had taken a step back and started seeing the world from a new perspective. There was something extraordinary in the stillness of my life, something I once thought was synonymous with loneliness. Now, no longer. Now it was synonymous with freedom. Fabiana, my nurse and friend, carefully observed this new behavior in me. She knew how much I had sacrificed to keep the family together, how much I had given without asking for anything in return. When she saw me with an expression of serenity, she commented, "Regina, you're different. Something has happened, hasn't it? You seem more peaceful, more at ease." I smiled, which to me was a gesture of gratitude for everything she had done for me recently. Fabiana knew about the decision I had made, and at many moments, she had been my confidant. But she also knew I needed a new beginning, something that would challenge me to move forward without looking back. Life had given me a rare opportunity, the chance to rebuild myself without the shadows of who I had once been. Over time, I began to dedicate myself to new activities, things I had always wanted to do but never had the courage to try for one reason or another. I started taking painting lessons, a hobby that had always fascinated me but that I had never considered serious enough to truly commit to. Every brushstroke on the canvas was like a relief. I was creating something that belonged exclusively to me, something no one could take away from me. More than that, painting brought me a kind of satisfaction I had never imagined possible. The pleasure of transforming the blank canvas into something meaningful, something that represented me, made me realize how I had stopped expressing myself over the years, how my own identity had been suffocated by others' expectations. The idea that my happiness no longer depended on anyone else was incredibly liberating. I gave myself permission to be selfish, not in the sense of being cruel or indifferent, but in the sense of putting myself as a priority. And that was a big step for me. However, I can't deny that the silence from my children weighed on me. Not in terms of regret, but with a quiet absence that sometimes made me question if there was something I could have done differently. But soon, this feeling faded, replaced by a profound understanding that I had nothing more to offer to those who didn't value me. Gradually, my home became a space that reflected my choices. The old furniture was replaced with newer, lighter pieces. Each room in the house was designed to provide comfort and well-being. I created a routine for myself, with time for painting, walks in the park, and moments of introspection. For me, this was a time of healing. My body and mind began to recover from the strain caused by the worn-out relationships with my children. With each step, I got closer to a more authentic version of myself. It was then that I began to realize that, even without my children, the world was full of possibilities. And, to my surprise, people began to seek me out in ways I hadn't expected. Some were old friends who had drifted away over time. Others were people I had met recently, who were captivated by my art and the new energy I radiated. One of these sunny afternoons, while I was painting on the porch, an old friend, Sylvia, showed up. She was one of those people I had left behind in the past due to my obsession with pleasing my children. "Regina, you're so different," Sylvia commented, sitting next to me. "I haven't seen this piece in you for many years. You're renewed." I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I felt comfortable with the words coming out of my mouth. I didn't need to lie or pretend. "I'm doing well, Sylvia. I'm finally allowing myself to be who I am." The conversation went on for hours, without haste, without judgment. I shared the changes I had made, and Sylvia, with a compassionate look, listened attentively. She, too, was going through a transition in her life and felt freer now than ever. Together, we exchanged ideas about freedom, self-sufficiency, and the meaning of reinvention. In the months that followed, my life began to take a completely new direction. Painting became a therapeutic form of expression and also a way to connect with others. My paintings began to be displayed in small galleries, and gradually, I found my place in this new scene. I was no longer a woman on the sidelines, waiting for recognition. I was there in the moment, doing what I loved, and that alone was the greatest achievement. Over time, the idea of writing also started to seduce me. For years, I had kept my feelings and thoughts in a journal, but I had never shared them with anyone. Writing seemed to me a way to release the words that had been trapped in my chest, but it also seemed like a way to show the world what I had learned, what I had to offer. I started writing a book about my experiences, about the lessons I had learned over the years, about the unconditional love I had given to those who didn't know how to recognize it, and about the importance of living for oneself. I didn't know if my book would ever be published, but the simple act of writing it already brought me an indescribable feeling of freedom. I was finally releasing what I had kept inside, no longer worried about others' approval, but only about the truth I wanted to share. Although, from time to time, the weight of my children's absence was still felt, I knew that this absence was no longer an emptiness, but a space filled with my own life. I was now the author of my destiny, the painter of my own work, and the woman who, finally, was living for herself. Freedom was not something I achieved all at once, but something I conquered with every step, with every decision. And what surprised me most was that, the more I embraced this path, the more I felt that my life was only just beginning. With each new day, I discovered more about myself, more about what I was capable of, and more about what it truly means to be free. Life seemed to be unfolding before me like an open book, with pages I was writing myself, each day more filled with colors, hopes, and even mysteries. The painting I had started was no longer just about the pain from before. Every brushstroke I made now reflected a stronger Regina, more self-aware. However, there was still an echo in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the decisions I had made and the unhealed wounds. The day Enrique, the oldest, appeared at my door, I didn't know what to expect. He was visibly thinner, with tired eyes, as if the years of absence and moments of indifference had taken their toll. What surprised me wasn't his presence, but the change in his expression. He no longer seemed like the arrogant son who had left me alone, but a lost man who seemed to regret something he couldn't fix. "Mom," he said, in a tone that seemed distant but also full of a sincerity I hadn't felt in a long time, "I know I was a terrible son. I know I wasn't there when you needed me the most. I know I didn't deserve your love or trust. But please, let me show you that I can change. I don't want this distance between us anymore." I watched him for a long time. This was the first time he had spoken to me without the usual defensiveness, without the arrogant posture of someone who thinks they can control everything. There, in front of me, was the man I had loved with all my heart, but who, at some point, had lost his way, lost us. The pain I felt wasn't the pain of betrayal. No, the pain was deeper. It was the pain of what could have been and never was. I had always hoped that my son would come back to me, asking for forgiveness, but I never imagined it would happen so unexpectedly, so raw. I expected him to come with promises, with words trying to erase the mistakes of years of neglect, but he didn't do that. He simply surrendered. And that made me realize that the anger I had inside me, the desire to punish them, no longer made sense. It was no longer what I wanted. "You hurt me a lot, Enrique," I began, my voice firm but calm. "And for a long time, I thought I needed to take revenge, make you pay for everything you did. I thought about removing you and your siblings from my will, leaving you with nothing. I thought about severing ties completely just like you did with me. But, I realized that actually what I wanted was to rid myself of the pain. And it's not worth carrying that weight, Enrique. Not anymore." He looked at me, a bit surprised, as if he had expected a more bitter reaction, perhaps even a shout of anger. But what he saw was a mother who had finally freed herself.
And he seemed to understand.
Mom, I don't know what I can do to fix all of this. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But still, I wanted to try. I took a deep breath. I was no longer in the position of wanting to punish. What I wanted, more than anything, was peace. I wanted peace for myself, for my soul, for my mind. The revenge I had carried inside me for so long no longer had space. I replaced it with a desire that was even more powerful, to move forward, without strings attached. My greatest challenge now wasn't revenge, but forgiveness, not for others, but for myself. Enrique, I said, my voice almost a whisper, the forgiveness you ask for is not something I can give or deny you. Forgiveness is something that comes from within, from whoever it may be. But I, as your mother, have already forgiven you. Not because you deserve it, but because I need to move forward in peace. He came closer, his eyes misty, and hugged me for the first time in many years. It was a sincere hug, without expectations, without promises. It was the hug of two human beings who, finally, found each other at a point of mutual understanding. And at that moment, I knew that the peace I had been seeking was already there, in that simple gesture. In the following days, Enrique's visit brought a calmness to my life. He didn't come back to formally ask for my forgiveness. He didn't come back to demand anything in return. He came back because, somehow, he was also tired of living with the weight of the past. And, like me, he was in search of freedom. When the subject of the will was mentioned, it wasn't with anger or a desire for revenge. It was no longer about punishing, but about doing what was best for me, without needing to subject my life to guilt or obligation. I decided, then, to remove my children from the will. Not as a form of punishment, but as a way to declare my emotional independence. They needed to understand that the true inheritance wasn't in material possessions, but in the lessons life offers us. And, at that moment, my lesson for them would be that you cannot possess a person's love by force or obligation. Love is earned, and my trust could no longer be given so easily as before. The following day was silent. The decision was made. I felt an unparalleled freedom. True freedom wasn't in being vengeful or in trying to mold others to my will. It was in being able to look at my children and say that, despite everything, I still loved them, but that my love for myself was stronger. Revenge, which had once dominated my thoughts, now seemed so distant, so unnecessary. I was healed. I was at peace. It wasn't the possessions that made me rich. It wasn't the belongings that defined me. What defined me now was the strength of a woman who had risen from the ashes, who had reconnected with her own essence, and who finally understood that, in order to be truly free, one must free themselves from the need for retaliation. And, by doing so, I achieved the peace I had longed for. The sun was slowly setting on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, while I watched the world from my studio. The brushstrokes that had once been attempts at expression now flowed naturally, almost as if I were sharing a part of my soul in every painting I created. Each canvas had its own story, and somehow, I knew I was rediscovering myself with each work. Deep down, each of them reminded me of a moment of transition, a movement away from pain, bitterness, and the weight of the past. I was truly creating a new life for myself. The memories of my children, of my old family, no longer haunted me as they once had. I had let them go, in a way that, to many, might have seemed helpless. But, for me, it was an act of self-sufficiency. In a quiet and definitive way, I had chosen myself. They would no longer be a part of my story in the way I once wished. Now, I was writing my own chapter. In the days that followed my decision to remove my children from the will, silence became an unexpected ally. There were no more demands, no more calls or empty messages of regret. What I wanted was space to live my choices, without the burden of being something I was no longer. Enrique's visits, which had once seemed like a gesture of reconciliation, disappeared. He didn't know how to deal with the change in me, and perhaps the absence of a mother who was submissive and willing to sacrifice herself for them bothered him more than he could admit. I didn't blame him. We were all in search of our own redemption. Maybe his was somewhere else, in a future that was still to come. However, there was something new in my daily life. Something I couldn't anticipate. When the phone rang, it was to invite me to art lectures or art exhibitions. When I opened the door, I found new faces, people who, like me, were in search of something more in life. It seemed as though the universe was offering me possibilities with every step. Even my painting work, which had once seemed marginal, was now gaining an unexpected relevance. One afternoon, I received an invitation for an exhibition at a renowned art gallery. It wasn't just any invitation. It was a rare opportunity to showcase my art to the public, to be recognized in a way I could never have imagined before. Art, which had once been my refuge, was now becoming my profession, my passion, and the way I could truly live from what I loved most. It was a chance that many artists desired, and I was grabbing it with all my strength. However, as always happens when we feel close to achieving our dreams, a shadow from the past extended over me. One of my children, Laura, reached out. It was the kind of message I had always expected, an apology, an attempt at recovery. Something she did to alleviate her own guilt, perhaps, but not a genuine change. The tone of the message was bitter and, at the same time, sweet. She didn't directly ask for forgiveness, but her words carried a promise of understanding. I know we did things wrong. I know our actions hurt you deeply. I know you have the right to follow your life, but I wish I could somehow reverse what happened between us. Forgive me, Mom. There was a weight in each word, but also a lightness. Something in Laura had changed. She no longer saw me as a source of unconditional support. She now saw me as someone who could choose her own path, someone who could step away without regret. And this, in some way, gave me the feeling that I was doing the right thing. However, reflecting on the message, I realized something even more important. I was no longer seeking their forgiveness.
It wasn't about that.
What had really happened in that moment was that I had already forgiven them, perhaps even before receiving the message. The forgiveness I sought, in fact, was forgiveness for myself. Forgiveness for submitting to years of pain and sacrifice without questioning. Forgiveness for not realizing sooner that, in order to be happy, I would need to free myself from the need to be necessary to everyone, to please everyone. I went to the exhibition, and it was there that a new reality revealed itself to me. Seeing people admiring my works, talking about them, recognizing my talent, I realized that my value was no longer tied to being a good mother, a good wife, or even a good daughter. My value was in what I created, in the way the world responded to my art and my heart. I no longer needed external validation to know I was on the right path. At the end of the exhibition, as I walked through the lit streets of the city, I realized I had left behind a woman who, though strong, still carried the remnants of a life full of expectations and failures. And the woman walking now was someone new, someone who would no longer define herself by the actions of others, nor by the pain of the past. I was a woman in search of her own happiness, her own peace. The cycle had closed. No longer a slave to pain, revenge, or the obligation to be something for others. I was finally ready to move forward, without looking back. My future no longer depended on any other human being, except for myself. The possibilities opened before me like a never-ending road, and I was more than ready to walk it. This was what life had taught me. The greatest legacy I could leave was my own freedom, my own authenticity. Forgiveness, peace, and happiness were for me, and no one else.